So how do you determine the right asset allocation?
Great question. So once you get the kind of the wants, wishes, needs of somebody's plan, and you're marrying that with sources of income and the 401k and everything that they might have saved outside of that. Once you do the risk tolerance, questionnaire as well, that's important. But once you kind of put all the puzzle pieces into this financial plan is whenever you can really kind of see, okay, what type of return do we, possibly need within this model to basically be able to deliver, the results or what they want to see happen in retirement.
Starting your route to retirement.
Welcome to the Guided Retirement Show. I'm your host, Dean Barber. Today, we're going to talk with Drew Jones. He's a certified financial planner, and we're going to be discussing what will be or may already be your largest asset. We're going to be talking about your 401k, whether you should be doing Roth 401k, traditional 401k. How do you decide on the optimum asset allocation with inside that 401k? All that and more in my conversation today with Drew Jones, certified financial planner. Please enjoy. And by the way, as you're watching this, if you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure and go ahead and like this video right away and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Drew Jones, certified financial planner. Welcome to the Guided Retirement Show.
Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you here. Today, Drew, we're going to talk about what is, if it's not already, it will be at some point in a person's life, their largest asset. I want to talk about 401ks today. It's a huge subject.
Right. There's a lot to it, too. A lot of moving parts, right?
Well, and the thing is that what happens when people go to work for their first company out of college and they say, hey, here's your 401k. And a lot of them today are doing an opt-out. So in other words, if you don't opt out of the 401k, they're going to automatically enroll you into that 401k.
Right.
And in almost every case, they're going to force you into what is a life cycle fund or a life stage fund. So that means that there's no control over the underlying investment. You're just putting money in and you're allowing this lifestyle fund, which is typically or life cycle fund, which is typically a fund of funds designed to create an asset allocation model, but it's all based on your age.
So technically, like as you were talking about, the closer you quote unquote should be getting closer to retirement is going to determine how much equities to fixed income you have. But by no means is that a correct measure maybe for you.
Right. I mean, it's not like whoever's running that 401k knows who you are, right? Because they have no idea. You're a name and a number, and that's basically it to the 401k administrator. The company you work for has basically said, we're going to provide a platform for you to save for retirement. And if you don't want to put money in, you have to tell us you don't want to put money in. Otherwise, we're going to start taking money out of your paycheck from the first day that you're eligible, and we're going to make a match, or some companies don't make a match, but some companies do make a match, right?
Right.
And the company provided the platform to make that happen, but and they vetted the funds that are in there or the ETFs that are inside the 401k, but they've not customized that to you. That is really your responsibility.
It absolutely is. And I mean, if you think about retirement, back in the old days, right? It was a three-legged stool approach. Most companies offered a pension, not all of them. Then you had Social Security, and then you had what you managed to kind of save along the way. So how many times do you see companies now really offering employees pensions?
It's very rare.
Very rare.
Your
right?
teachers, your government employees, they'll have pensions. And then there are a handful of companies out there that still do offer pensions. But for the most part, with the advent of the 401k, most companies have gone to the idea that we're going to provide a platform for you to save into. We're going to make a match of your contributions to some fashion, and then you decide how you want to invest it. So in other words, the onus of getting it right goes right on to the individual, the employee.
Absolutely.
And, it was sad back in 2008 when we had a market that fell by over 50%. And the saying on the street was your 401k just turned into a 201k because it was cut in half. And people really didn't understand the amount of risk that they had in there. Now, if you're a young person just starting out and you're just starting to put money into that 401k, you're dollar cost averaging, which means you're buying it wherever the share price is on every time that a deposit gets made into that 401k. So the ups and downs of the market early on shouldn't really make a difference.
Yeah, it's more of a benefit, I would say, to a younger person, to your exact point, right? Like you're buying less when the market's high, you're buying more, when it's low.
Right.
Averaging it out. So.
Averaging it out. And in a in long-term scenarios, dollar cost averaging works. It's been proven time and time again. And if you don't understand what dollar cost averaging is, get out your Google machine and check it out, because that's how you figure out. There's a lot of great examples of what dollar cost averaging is, but that's not why we're here today. So here's the thing with the 401k, Drew, because this will be the largest asset that most people ever accumulate, but it's almost impossible. Now, there's some technology that's come along that's made it possible to a much higher degree, but it's been very, very difficult for a certified financial planner like yourself to actually integrate the management of that 401k into a person's overall financial picture. So I'm just going to paint a picture here, and I want you, from a certified financial planner's perspective, Drew, how you approach this. So let's say that we have somebody that wants to come in and talk about their overall financial plan. They want to get a plan put together so that they can get to retirement. They want to buy a second home. There's things that they want to do. And they come in, and the vast majority of their money is inside of their 401k plan, which is going to have limited investment choices.
Correct.
And limited ability to trade or make changes without some significant restrictions most of the time. How do you address that in the overall plan?
Well, I think kind of the first step too is whenever you're putting together this plan, and I think it's really important in this stage of things, is to get a risk assessment on someone. And so whenever I talk about a risk assessment, there are those kind of questionnaires out there that talk more about kind of, how did you feel when you're investing in the market? We take a risk assessment and we look at it from a dollars and cents standpoint, right? So if I have this much money, and what am I willing to potentially risk to gain? And so that's really kind of a starting point, is to get somebody's level of risk and their comfort level. Because how many times have you seen it? I know I've seen it quite a few times where somebody has a lower risk score, but their 401k, whenever we plug the actual holdings into that software, is saying something completely different.
It happens all the time, Drew, but I think that's where the disconnect is for a lot of people. They don't know really how much risk they're taking with inside their 401k. And as that 401k gets larger and larger and larger, and you get closer to retirement, you really have to pay attention to that.
Right.
Absolutely. So, but how do you integrate that into the plan? That's the deal, right? I mean, let's say that somebody comes in and they've got $1 million and 700,000 of it's in the 401k, and there's $300,000 that you as the certified financial planner can really influence or manage. There is technology today that we're using as we speak to help people manage those 401ks and create the allocation models in there and do those types of things. We actually actively go in and make the trades for them. But again, there's limited choices. So do you start with the limited choices that are within the 401k? Let's go back. Risk assessment first, understand the ideal allocation for the individual. Then we peer into what's inside the 401k that we can utilize to fit that, and then build the piece outside of it so that it goes around the 401k. Is that kind of how you do it?
Right. I would say component, and again, going back to the plan and the goals and when that person wants to retire, age of that person that's coming in to see us, will determine some of the things that you might look at as an alternative to, what stays in the 401k, or if you're eligible to roll the 401k out to an IRA.
And some companies do have what's called an in-service distribution, where they'll allow for somebody to roll money out at a certain age, even if they continue to work for that company. And of course, if they do that, they still get to make contributions. There's still the company match and all that.
Right.
So how do you determine the right asset allocation?
Great question. So once you get the kind of the wants, wishes, needs of somebody's plan, and you're marrying that with sources of income and the 401k and everything that they might have saved outside of that. Once you do the risk tolerance, questionnaire as well, that's important. But once you kind of put all the puzzle pieces into this financial plan, is whenever you can really kind of see, okay, what type of return do we, possibly need within this model to basically be able to deliver, the results or what they want to see happen in retirement.
So you're going to look for based on the resources that an individual has and what their future goals are, you want to identify what does the money need to do in order for them to accomplish those objectives.
Right. Absolutely.
Then you can go in and build the asset allocation model that, from a historical perspective, gives them the highest probability of achieving that return with the least amount of risk possible.
Correct.
And so if somebody comes in and they've got a risk score that says, hey, I'm a moderately conservative investor, yet you're saying the moderately conservative portfolio isn't going to get you the returns you need. So we're going to have to talk about some trade-offs, right?
Mm-hmm.
A, you got to save more,
right?
Or B, you're going to have to work longer,
right?
Yep. Or C, we increase the risk in the portfolio and in an attempt to get a better rate of return. But I think once you can have those intelligent conversations with people and they can see what's the difference there, then they can start to make a better decision on, how should the money be allocated inside that 401k. So let's talk a little bit, Drew, about the match on the 401k. And of course, it's going to be different company by company, depending upon what their plan document says. But most companies out there that offer a 401k have some sort of a matching element to that. So explain the match.
So the match is whenever you're brought on board, right? It's more of kind of a perk to get employees, right? It's an added benefit to working for the company. So what the match is basically saying, you contribute so much and we'll contribute, or we'll kick in a certain percentage of what you're saving as well. So it basically kind of ties you with the company, and they're kind of going back to our analogy of the three-legged stool where you had the pension, Social Security, and what you saved. You're saving for retirement now, but the company's kind of helping you get there too.
Right. So an example may be a company might say, look, we'll match you 50 cents on the dollar for the first 6% that you contribute, right? So that's pretty simple math. If you could put 6% into your 401k, there's going to be a total of 9% of whatever your compensation is that's going to go into the 401k because the company is going to match 50 cents on the dollar.
Right.
There are some more generous companies out there that do a dollar for dollar match up to 4%. Some of them do a dollar for dollar match up to 6%. Those are very generous, matching contributions. But in the matching contribution side to that, you'll be able to identify it on your 401k statement. It'll say, here's your contributions, here's the company's matching contributions, and then here's the value of each one of those. So that's designed to get people to understand that, hey, the company's done more for me than just provide me with a job.
Right.
They're actually helping to fund my retirement. I want to switch gears a little bit and go to the different types of 401ks, because most people today have an option between doing the traditional 401k and doing the Roth 401k. And there's a big difference between the two. And there are times when people should be doing the Roth 401k, and there are times when people should be doing the traditional 401k. So first, I want you to explain what's the difference between the traditional 401k and the Roth 401k.
So the Roth 401k, what that is after-tax dollars going into the Roth portion, right? And you kind of brought it up earlier, the employer match, right? The employer match will still go to a traditional 401k, whereas if you're just doing all traditional 401k, all that money is going in pre-tax. And so what ends up happening, obviously, is that money is going pre-tax, has never been taxed. So once you start to take that money out is whenever you will pay that tax.
And so how does the Roth work?
So going back to the Roth, so whenever you're putting that money in after tax, it's sitting there growing and growing and growing, right? And when you retire, though, when you pull that money out, there is no tax paid on it.
So your Roth 401k becomes a totally tax-free source of income in retirement, where your traditional 401k will become a fully taxable source of income in retirement.
So when I'm sitting down and talking it through with people, and we're talking about Roth 401ks and maybe the importance versus the traditional 401k, I use kind of the simplest analogy and saying, okay, in retirement, whenever you have that money in a Roth 401k, when you pull that money out, you pull a dollar out, you're going to get that dollar, assuming that you meet all the specific requirements. But with, the pre-tax or using a traditional 401k, when you take that dollar out, you're probably going to net, 70, 75 cents on that dollar by the time you pay those taxes.
Right. And there's another, I think, a distinct advantage to the Roth 401k. and it revolves around how money is taxed in retirement. And so one of the things that I think helps us make a decision on whether a person should be doing Roth or traditional is understanding how much their Social Security is going to be and when they plan on claiming that Social Security, because distributions from a Roth IRA don't count as something called provisional income when it comes to determining how much of your Social Security is going to be taxable. So in other words, let's say that somebody had $50,000 of combined Social Security and they've got $100,000 in withdrawals coming in from their Roth IRAs. How much tax will that person pay? Zero, right?
Yep.
Because Social Security by itself is not taxable, and Roth 401k distributions are not taxable, and Roth 401ks don't show up as part of the formula to determine if any of your Social Security should become taxable. So there's a huge benefit there. So when people are doing the comparison of should I do traditional versus Roth, they can't just look at traditional versus Roth. They got to look at how the distributions of those either Roth or traditional are going to play out and how they're going to play with all of the other sources of income that a person might have in retirement.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to the importance of having that overall plan in place. You're talking about Google. If you just get on there and you start typing like, should I do Roth 401k versus traditional 401k? Like the most basic, simple answer that you're going to get is like, well, try to predict where you think you might be tax-wise in the future, right? Well, that's really no help to anybody because, again, that very basic information doesn't know the specific person that's sitting in front of the computer typing it in.
Right. I can give you two examples of like easy to choose whether I should do traditional or whether I should do Roth. Whether I should do Roth, okay. Let's take somebody that's fresh out of school, and I'll take some of my children that have, they've graduated college, they're gainfully employed, and we talk to them about, okay, you're going to sign up for the 401k. We're not going to use one of these funds where they get to pick your investments. We're going to teach you how to pick the right investments. And your chances are when you're first in that job and probably for the first 8 to 10 years, you're probably going to be in the lowest tax bracket you're ever going to be in your life. So the tax deduction for the traditional 401k doesn't make any sense at that point in time. So they should be putting 100% of their contributions into the Roth portion of that 401k, giving that tax-free growth decades to compound, right? And you flip that around and you've got somebody that's 55 years old, they're in their peak earning years, and let's say the combined family income is now $250,000. Well, they're up in one of the higher tax brackets out there. And let's also further assume that this couple has done a good job and they save some money outside the 401k. House is going to be paid for when they go into retirement, and their living expenses are going to be far less when they go into retirement because they will have no debt. Now, that individual, I'm going to tell you, pile it all into the traditional 401k because the tax deduction that you'll get today at the high tax brackets that you're in, then once you will be substantial. And then once you retire, we roll that to a 401k, and then we do methodical year-by-year conversions, staying in a 12 to 22% bracket. And so if we were able to defer it in a 32% bracket and then convert it to a Roth IRA in a 12% bracket, for the first 5 to 7, maybe 8 years of retirement, then all of a sudden you've won that game, right? You got money into the Roth at a much lower tax rate.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, that's what coming back to having that plan in place and running those simulations. That's some of the neat stuff about some of the software that I use is you can see the impacts of staying under those brackets. But what does it do whenever I compare it versus doing nothing at all, right? How much more do I pay in tax by not doing the Roth conversions?
So I think let's go back to this. Do I do a traditional or do I do a Roth? So when you're creating a financial plan for somebody using our guided retirement system, you can show the difference in the future results if you save into a Roth versus if you save into a traditional. And then it's right there in black and white.
Absolutely.
Right? And it's like, okay, this is a no-brainer. Right? Either A, you're going to do the traditional, or B, you're going to do the Roth, but we can back it up with data that says this is why you should be doing what you're doing. Yet the vast majority of people either watching us here on YouTube or listening to us on the podcast, they're guessing.
Yeah.
It's hard to fathom the lack of education when it comes to what a person should be doing. And the HR, they typically are like, I don't know, you choose, right?
Yeah.
It's not my decision.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people that I've seen that have maybe been coming in for the first time, they're kind of getting advice from the guy in the cubicle next to him. I'm sure he's a great guy, great person, great gal, but sometimes, that's not the person you want to take the advice from.
Right.
So again, that's why you want to have a kind of a complete picture of what you're doing for yourself. So,
and we did put together a really interesting piece called the 401k Survival Guide, which people will be able to get through a link in the show notes. But that 401k Survival Guide talks about a lot of those ins and outs of the Roth versus traditional and all of that. And I would encourage anybody that's either watching us on YouTube or listening to us on the podcast to hit that link in the show notes and get a copy of that 401k Survival Guide, because we go into a lot of details there. But I don't think there's not really a rule of thumb here on how much should you contribute, or should you do traditional, or should you do Roth, and how should your asset allocation be? There's always been that rule. Okay, well, just own your age in bonds, right? Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? That's just
right.
It's like treating us all like cattle, right?
Yeah.
And we're not. We all have our own personal, unique financial situations that need to be looked at, and they need to be looked at by a professional that understands what are the future implications of what you're doing today.
And that's something else that we also talk about a lot too. And I wanted to bring it up too whenever you were talking about the Roth conversions. Again, it's talking to understanding the person and what their kind of wants and wishes and needs are. If you're talking with somebody and legacy is important to them, right? Like, there's all kind of more reason to open up a discussion about how important Roths can be with the Secure Act. I also have a lot of conversations with clients where maybe the legacy to the kids isn't that important, right? But what would happen if something were to happen to the spouse?
That's a big deal. And I don't think a lot of people really take that into consideration, but that's one of the stress tests that we'll do in the plan, is to say, what happens if there's an early demise of one of the spouses, right? How is that surviving spouse's tax bracket going to change?
Absolutely.
And that can then give us a lot of insight into whether we should be doing traditional or whether we should be doing Roth. But literally, you can run stress tests on all kinds of different what-if scenarios to help you make the right decision on whether you should be doing traditional or Roth.
Yeah.
I would say that anybody, Drew, that has a company that's willing to match, that the minimum amount that you should be contributing to that 401k is the amount up to which that company will match. Absolutely. So if that company will match up to the first 5%, the minimum amount you should be contributing is 5%. Yeah. If that company will match up to 8%, the minimum amount you should be contributing is 8%, because it's free money that the company's ready and willing to give you. You just have to put some of your own in first.
And I would say this kind of speaks to maybe the younger people or the people watching that have kids or grandkids, and that would be to start early.
Absolutely. The day you start your first job, get in and sign up for the 401k, understand how much the match is, and make sure that you're contributing up to that match. And then as you get raises, decide which portion of that raise you want to go into that 401k as well.
Yep.
The people that start saving early will wind up accumulating a heck of a lot more money because they've got time on their side.
Right.
So let's go back and discuss a piece that gets messed up a lot, and that is the beneficiary designation on the 401k.
Right.
How should the beneficiary designation be chosen, and how should it be completed?
I guess we have to talk about what time in our life are we at, right?
Well, let's just say that it's the young person that's getting ready to start. They're starting their job. We can go with them first.
Okay. So I would say young person, right? Not married yet. You're going to want to obviously put, family, any type of siblings, maybe mother, father, as your primary beneficiary, right? So if anything were to happen to you, who do you want 100% of this money to go to?
And it can go in percentages, right? If you got five siblings, you can 5 siblings, you can split it between the 5 siblings, 20% each. Or there's a lot of. I've seen a lot of scenarios over my 35 years in this industry, Drew, where people will just put the estate of Drew Jones. Well, what does that do? Now all of a sudden, that the estate of Drew Jones doesn't have a life expectancy, right? That's not even a real thing.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that all of the money has to come out of that 401k immediately. It immediately becomes taxable. Okay. And then who decides where the money goes? Probate courts.
Yep.
Okay. Don't ever do that. Don't ever put the estate of yourself as the beneficiary. But your beneficiary forms on your 401k, in my opinion, you should be reviewing those at least once a year to make sure that it is exactly what you want.
Yep.
And if you're going to have a trust as a beneficiary, you're older, you're trying to control the wealth distribution down to children and grandchildren, and you want a trust to do that, you need to make sure that your trust qualifies as a see-through trust and that it can actually receive those 401k dollars and then distribute them amongst the ultimate beneficiaries. Because if it doesn't qualify as a see-through trust and that trust is the beneficiary, that trust has no life expectancy, and all distributions of IRAs and 401ks are based on life expectancy. So that could cause the entire amount to be taxable immediately.
Yep.
If you get divorced, if you get remarried, these things require you to go back and address that beneficiary form as well.
Yeah, I've seen situations like that, right, where we've been doing reviews of outside accounts, and maybe there's just a fresh divorce. Sometimes you will still see the ex-spouse as the primary beneficiary, right, even though they may have remarried or they're obviously not together at that point. So that's a big issue. To your point of reviewing every year to make sure that you keep that as clean as possible.
Well, and here's another caveat there, and this is an area that you're not going to get from like your 401k administrator. You're not going to get it from your HR department. So there was a scenario, and this is an actual court case that happened, and people that have listened to the Guided Retirement Show have seen my interviews with Ed Slott, who's considered America's IRA expert. Not only have I been studying with him for over 15 years, but I also sat on his advisory board for a number of years. So one of the court cases that we were going through here maybe 4 years ago happened to surround an individual whose spouse had passed away. And the individual was a man. He did the right thing when the spouse passed away, and he went and put his 3 adult children as a third as primary beneficiaries on the 401k. Exactly the right thing to do, right? But about 5 years later, he met a new woman and got remarried. 6 months after he was remarried, he dropped dead of a sudden heart attack. And the children were all 3 still named as primary beneficiaries on the 401k.
Yeah.
It's what he wanted.
Right.
Okay. However, the new spouse of 6 months wound up getting 100% of the 401k because in order for the children to be named as primary beneficiaries, there has to be spousal consent. Okay. This was a new spouse that didn't consent to the children being primary beneficiaries. And so by law, all of the money in the 401k went to the new spouse of 6 months. Okay. And he wouldn't have known that. He would not have known that.
Absolutely.
And he wouldn't even have thought to ask his HR department. He would not have thought to ask. But this is a huge one, and we see this getting missed more than I want to mention.
Yeah.
But this thing went all the way to the California Supreme Court. The kids were fighting to try to get the money, and the court just basically said, the rule's simple. The law's there, right? And your dad didn't follow the rules of the law. Yeah. And so that surviving spouse of 6 months got all the money and didn't really care to share it with the 3 kids.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Money can do crazy things, but that beneficiary form is critical.
Absolutely.
It's critical. You got to make sure that it's done right.
Yes.
So I want to go back to really quickly your idea of helping people in their 401k to understand what kind of a targeted return do we need to get. And the only way you do that is by creating your well thought out written plan. And we use a system called the Guided Retirement System that basically says, here's all the resources I have. Here's my ability to save. Here's what I want to have happen in the future. Based on all that, what's the rate of return? And then you can come in as the certified financial planner and say, okay, based on the choices that you have with inside your 401k, these are the allocations that are going to help you get that return with the least amount of risk possible.
It's obviously seeing what they have and knowing kind of what that asset allocation, to your point, what's that rate of return, what's my risk, right, in that rate of return, and then utilizing the asset allocation as it is. So
I tell you, anybody that's watching us on YouTube right now or listening to us on the podcast, if you go to a link in the show notes, you're going to see a spot where you can have access to our calendars, and you can schedule a complimentary consultation with one of our certified financial planners. And Drew, when you do that complimentary consultation, it's basically people get to ask you questions, and you get to ask them questions, and you get them to think about things that maybe they didn't think about before. But it's a way for them to get to understand what would it be like to get a chance to work with a certified financial planner, and how do I pay the certified financial planner? All those questions can be answered in that complimentary consultation. So talk a little bit about what that experience would feel like for a person.
Yeah. So it's what we do is we walk through what we offer, how we do it here at Barber Financial Group. We talk about the series of meetings. We talk about the way that we prioritize your goals, right? We take people through a pretty fun exercise. We get a lot of information from people, going through this priority exercise. So again, whenever I say, we marry with, what you have with what you want, this whole process helps in doing that, right?
I think of it as marrying your life with your money, and for a lot of times, the very first time ever.
Right. And so then what we'll do is we talk about the process, how we go through it. Again, we talk about the series of appointments, so how we're doing everything ahead of time, right?
And do you give them kind of a look at what would the relationship look like in the future if they decided to engage with you?
Correct. Yep. So we run through the reviews that we do, what we're going to look at in each review, right? So that check box is getting marked every year. And it may be things like what we were talking about is looking at the beneficiaries. If you've got a trust estate plan in place, reviewing that. Obviously, looking at the asset allocation and the plan is important, but just as important is the tax planning that we'll look at year in and year out for clients.
Yeah. And in that complimentary consultation, would you do a risk assessment for somebody and then kind of plug their stuff in and say, do they match?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's one of the things that we like to know is what's your risk assessment? Because like I said before, we've seen people's, once we see their 401ks and are able to plug their 401k into the software, is saying something completely different, right? Yeah. And to your point of, people that are getting closer to retirement, that is their biggest nest egg. And so you want to make sure that you're trying to get a good rate of return, right? But you also want to be taking that least amount of risk that you have to take in order to achieve all those wants, wishes, and needs. So
absolutely. Well, Drew, thanks so much for joining me here on the Guided Retirement Show. The 401k is a complex beast. It does become one of the largest assets that people have, and it's really critical that they pay attention to all aspects of the 401k.
It truly is. So, and thank you so much for having me. I do appreciate it.
I had a great time talking with Drew Jones there. Look, there's so many questions that need to be answered, and this being one of your largest assets, this is not something to just leave to chance or to guesswork. So click the link in the show notes, schedule a complimentary consultation with one of my certified financial planners. Make sure that your 401k is getting all the attention that it needs so that one of these days you can actually let your money go to work for you, and that's what I call financial independence.
Starting your route to retirement.